So in chapter 5, we talked about being able to factor these quadratic equations. A quadratic equation is something that has x squared as the highest exponent. Now we're going to talk about how to solve them. And first, we need to be able to use our factoring skills from last chapter in order to solve. So there are lots of times where we solve these equations and we call our solutions by different names. So the solutions are the final numbers that we get, where we say x equals this number or x equals these two numbers. We call those solutions, roots, zeros, and x-intercepts. And we find those by factoring, graphing, or solving these equations. So we've got a 4-step process here in order to figure that out. So I'll go through that example first, and then I'm going to hop to the back side here and do one that's on the back. So first thing we want to do is make sure that we set our equation equal to 0. So we want all of our terms on one side of our equation, and this y right here will get switched over to 0. So first step, change y out for 0. So I've got 0 equals x squared plus 3x minus 10. And so we're going to factor, not necessarily the left side, we just need to factor whichever side actually has the quadratic equation. Doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right. So I want to factor x squared plus 3x minus 10. So this is the same thing that we were doing last chapter. We'll have 0 equals 2 parentheses with x as my variable, and I'm going to set up that x method. Multiply for negative 10, add to get positive 3. Well, if I multiply to get a negative number, that means one of my terms is positive and one is negative. And my factors of 10 are 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. So the only way that this works is for a positive 5 and a negative 2. So this is where things are still very similar to what we've done in the past. The only difference is now it says 0 equals. Well, the only variable in our equation now is x. So what we can do is we can take each of these factors for step 3 and set each one equal to 0. The reason that works is because if I have one thing times another to get 0, the only way to multiply and get 0 is if I take 0 times something. It could even be 0 times 0. So I'll take, for step 3, and have 0 equals x plus 5. And my second part, x minus 2. So I've got two different equations now, but they still combine to make my first equation. And I want to get x by itself, so I'll get minus 5 here since it's being added. And so I'll have x equals negative 5. Over here, I would add 2 to both sides, and that would make this x equals, 2. Now, you might be thinking, well, this would have said negative 5 equals x over here, and same thing, this would have been the opposite way. It really doesn't matter which way that you say equals. Remember, in mathematics, we have this property called the property of symmetry, which tells us that we can say the same thing in other directions if they are equal. So since we said negative 5 equals x, we can also say x equals negative 5. The last thing says to write your answer using curly brackets. So the reason why we do the curly brackets is because the curly brackets set up what's called a set. My set of answers are negative 5, 2. It's not a coordinate point. If I were to create these as coordinate points, I would have 2 coordinate points. One when x is negative 5, and we said y is 0. And another one when x is positive 2, and again we said y was 0. That was the first step. We plugged 0 in for y. So curly brackets means that we have 2 different solutions, not a coordinate point. Parentheses show us a coordinate point. So you could try out a couple of different examples here from the first page. But what I would ultimately like to do is to do an example here from the back side. I'm going to do example 20. Let me get 20 up and ready here. Now, for your assignment tomorrow, your problems are going to look very similar to these last 6, and you'll have 2 to do from this first page. So you'll want to make sure that you do 2 probably from this bottom part here. So I'm going to do 20. Now, this one looks a little bit different already. I've got x squared minus 10x plus 49 equals 4x plus 1. Well, I don't want to have everything all crazy over here. So one of your clues here says to move. This means to put everything on one side together. So I want to have x squared, my x's, and my numbers all over here. In order to do that, I need to get rid of 4x and positive 1 over here. Since they're positive, I need to subtract them to get to the other side. And so I'll have x squared minus 14x plus 48 equals 0. Now again, we would want to do the same thing. We're still going to factor this. Multiply to get 48, add to get negative 14. If I multiply to get a positive, add to get a negative, these two numbers have to be negative. And I know the factors for 48 that would add up to give me 14 would be 6 and 8. So I would set up my 2 factors, x minus 6, x minus 8, and set that equal to 0. Now, remember, our second part of this factor piece is to take and set both factors equal to 0. Now, the parentheses really don't matter at this point anymore because the parentheses up here were only to make sure that we knew to double distribute our factors to each other. But since it's just one factor on its own now, you don't need those parentheses, so you could get rid of those if you wanted to. But I want to get x by itself in both cases. Since this is a negative 6, I'm going to add 6 to both sides and get that x equals positive 6. And same thing over here, add 8 to both sides, and I get that x equals a positive 8. And I'll set up my answer in curly brackets for 6, 8. So try at least 2 different examples. They can be the 2 that are on the bottom. You could try 2 from the back side here, but just do 2 from at least the back page here. So then we've got our other factoring method that we've talked about. We've talked about that slip and slide method. So let's go over an example using that with solving. It's very similar, but there's one extra piece that will end up happening once we have done that slip and slide factor. So I'll just do example 1. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to do, let's do example 3. So we're going to do example number 3. So I've got 2x squared plus 3x minus 5. It's already set to be equal to 0, so I don't have to worry about that at all. So what I want to do now is I want to make sure, if I'm factoring something and there's a number in front of x squared, I want to make sure that I can't take a greatest common factor out. So if I have 2x squared, 3x, and minus 5, well, 2, 3, and 5 have nothing in common except for 1 to divide by, and I know that 1 won't change my numbers anyway, so I can't do that. So I'll want to use that slip and slide method and take 2 times 5. So now I have x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. And I'll factor this one out using that x method. Negative 10, positive 3. In order to multiply and get a negative, 1 is positive, 1 is negative. And if it's a positive 3, my factors for 10 are 5 and 2. We did that on the last page, so you could always look back there too. That was the same number setup. So now I would set up my 2 factors. I would have x plus 5 and x minus 2 and equal to 0. Now again though, I want to make sure that I'm using that slip and slide method. I slipped 2 to the end So now I have to slide 2 out of each of my factors. So 5 divided by 2 and 2 divided by 2. 2 does not simplify with 5 at all. So I know that if it doesn't simplify, I'm just going to take that denominator and move it in front of that variable. So now this says 2x plus 5. And over here, 2 does simplify with itself. Anything divided by itself will give you 1. So now what we would do is we would again take our 2 factors and set them equal to 0. So I've got 2x plus 5 equals 0, and x minus 1 equals 0. For this first one, I still want to get x by itself, but notice that now there's a 2 in front. So remember how we have to do our solving for equations is I want to get only variables on one side and only numbers on the other. So that means I need to move my 5 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 5. Now I have 2x equals negative 5. Dividing both sides by 2. Again, we talked about this earlier, that 2 does not go into 5 at all. So I'll just leave it as a fraction and say that x equals negative 5 halves. Over here, if I want to get x by itself, I have this minus 1 here. So I'll do its opposite and add 1 to both sides. If I do that, I have x equals positive 1. And my answer would be in curly brackets, negative 5 halves, positive 1. So again, we're doing kind of the same steps using that slip and slide. The only difference is that once I have my factors, I'm going to split my 2 factors to 2 different equations and solve for x. So we'll want to do a couple of examples here as well. Let's do 2 examples on the back page here. So you'll want to do 2 examples between 5 and 12, and 2 examples from that first page from 9 to 22. Don't forget to check in.